Hello and welcome to everyone tuning in. It is great to have you here. And welcome to this webinar hosted by the Impact Management Platform. I am Jo Fackler, manager of the Impact Management Platform. And for those perhaps a little less familiar with the platform, it is a collaboration between the leading providers of international public goods standards, frameworks, and guidance for managing impact. These organizations are coordinating efforts to mainstream the practice of impact management by working to clarify what impact management means to all types of enterprises, investors, and financial institutions, as well as to make progress towards a system of impact management resources and to engage with policymakers in the process. And so in today's webinar, I am joined by a fantastic set of speakers from across the platform partners to discuss the progress that they have made on these activities to date. And that is since they have launched the platform in November 2021. So this webinar itself coincides with the launch of 3 pieces of work that the partners have collaborated on together. This work represents their consensus view on the meaning and practice of impact management and comprises, firstly, a thought piece that clarifies the imperative for impact management as not only a human and environmental imperative, but as a critical means to sustaining economic and financial performance. Alongside that is also an iteration to the actions of impact management, and these actions outline the core steps for all types of organizations to manage their impacts. And I should say that when we use the term organizations today, we are talking about enterprises, investors, and financial institutions collectively. And then the final deliverable is an explanation of the key terms and concepts related to impact management. So all of these materials are accessible on the Impact Management Platform website. We'll provide a little bit more information on that a little bit later in the webinar. But also there is a download section in this Bright Talk webinar interface. And so if you click on that button, you will be able to see all of those deliverables that I just mentioned. So please do take a look at those in your own time. For now, though, let's move on with the program. So on the agenda today, we will hear from firstly, 2 high-level representatives of the platform partners. That will start with Achim Steiner, who is the administrator of the UN Development Programme, and then also Mathias Cormann, the Secretary General of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. We will then have 3 panels. The first is hosted by Eric Usher, who is the head of UNDP and co-chair to the platform. And so Eric, along with his panelists, will discuss the urgent need for all enterprises, investors, and financial institutions to adopt impact management. Afterwards, we'll have a second panel, and that will be with Romina Bororini. Romina is the director of the OECD Center on Wellbeing, Inclusion, Sustainability, and Equal Opportunities, and also the co-chair to the platform as well. Romina, alongside her panelists, will be focusing on what is needed to progress a complete and coherent system of norms and resources for impact management as a way to mainstream that practice. And then finally, I will be moderating a panel on the role of policy in mainstreaming impact management. Whilst we don't have time today for dedicated Q&A, we are very much listening and hearing you all who are tuned into this session live. And so we do very much encourage you to still submit your questions and your feedback. There is a Q&A function that you will find on your screens. And as we move through the panels, we will endeavour to address many of the questions in the flow of the conversations, but we will also ensure to follow up on several of those questions following this webinar. So we will move now on with the programme and kicking off with some short messages from 2 heads of the partner organisations, starting with Achim Steiner, the administrator of the UN Development Programme.
Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme, my dear friend and colleague Inger Andersen, Secretary General of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, my dear colleague Mathias Cormann. Dear colleagues and friends, unfortunately, I'm unable to join you live today, as was my hope. I am, however, delighted to join the launch of the Impact Management Platform's package of deliverables via this brief video message. The United Nations Development Programme has been part of the platform and its predecessor, the Impact Management Project's Structured Network, since 2018. In fact, our own work on the SDG impact standards germinated out of that original involvement. This launch comes as our shared business plan for a better future, the Sustainable Development Goals, is significantly off course. Currently, just 12% of SDG targets are on track. When it comes to climate action, the quantity of net zero commitments being made by organizations has increased substantially. Yet the quality of those targets and action towards them is lacking for the most part. That is reflected in a new report published in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. It found that while most companies engage with the SDGs, most do so for communications and reporting purposes. Notably, it found that only approximately 1 in 10 companies had integrated the SDGs across their business. Indeed, much attention is currently being directed towards sustainability-related disclosures with the creation of the International Sustainability Standards Board. There are also a range of new regulations across various jurisdictions. That includes the suite of corporate and product disclosures that are being mandated in the European Union. A key concern is that organizations become so focused on reporting and compliance that they lose sight of the strategic value of the SDGs to increase resilience and unlock future growth opportunities. While transparency and reporting are important, they are insufficient in isolation to drive change at the pace needed. We need to fully integrate impact management into how organizations operate and make decisions. Stronger impact management will also prepare organizations for increased disclosure and corporate governance regulations. It will also underpin better quality disclosures and reporting to external stakeholders. As our window of opportunity to limit the worst effects of climate change closes rapidly, we need a hard reset. This is where the Impact Management Platform and this package of deliverables has a key role to play. It highlights the increasing importance of impact management for businesses, investors, and financial institutions. It will allow practitioners to better navigate the complex landscape of impact-related standards, tools, and data. That is, to pinpoint the frameworks and tools they need to transform their sustainability, net zero, and SDG commitments into action. It will also help them to anticipate risks earlier and manage them better. That means leaning into sustainability-related trends to capitalize on new growth opportunities. Dear colleagues, impact must be at the core of every consumption, employment, business and investment decision we now make. In this respect, I would like to acknowledge the UNDP Finance Initiative and the OECD for the outstanding work they have undertaken in their role as co-chairs of the Impact Management Platform since its inception. It is based on a recognition that the perceived trade-off between the social, environmental and economic interests must be finally consigned to the past. Crucially, the private sector's bottom line needs much more emphasis on the returns to the shareholders that really matter. And that is people and planet. Thank you.
Many thanks to Achim there. And we will now be hearing from Mathias Cormann, Secretary General of the OECD, who is following on having since welcomed the launch of the platform back in November 2021. So over to Mathias.
A very warm welcome to you all, to our co-chairs, to members of the steering committee, our platform partners, distinguished guests, colleagues, friends all. To achieve our climate and sustainable development goals, we need to give ourselves the tools that help us secure the outcomes we need. To make the right decisions, to make better decisions to improve on the trajectory we're on, we need to understand, based on objective data and evidence, what works and what doesn't work, what is taking us in the right or the wrong direction. Core to making this possible is effective impact management. We need effective impact management. The processes, strategies and frameworks to measure, monitor and optimize the social, environmental and economic impact of an organization or project. the improved understanding based on a credible assessment of the positive and negative impacts an entity creates, to enable concrete steps to maximize the positives while minimizing or mitigating the negatives. The setting of goals, collection of data, analyzing performance, all to make better informed decisions to ensure we make the best possible progress as we, as swiftly as possible, progress towards meeting our climate and sustainable development goals. However, the growing number of initiatives supporting different aspects of impact management have been difficult for enterprises and investors to navigate. To help address this, the OECD, the UN Environment Programme Finance Initiative and our platform partners are collaborating to produce a complete, comprehensive and coherent system of standards and resources for impact management. Today, we are launching several important resources, including a paper on the imperative for impact management, which delves into the relationship between impact, system-wide risk, and materiality. A set of key terms and concepts used in impact management to promote a common global approach, and a consolidated set of actions of impact management which will enable organizations, investors, and financial institutions to better manage their sustainability impacts. All of which are available on the platform's website alongside the recently revised OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises on responsible business conduct, which is our work on measuring the business impacts on people's well-being, and the OECD's UN Development Programme impact standards for financing sustainable development. We hope you will find all these resources useful, and I'm confident that through our joint efforts, we will make impact management more impactful.
Many thanks to Mathias for his contribution there. And so now let's move on to our first panel. Why do enterprises, investors, and financial institutions urgently need to adopt impact management? If I could have that slide, please. Thank you. So this session will be moderated by Eric Usher. Eric is the head of UNDP and co-chair to the Impact Management Platform. And joining him here today are Clay Brown, the head of Standards, Certification and Product Delivery at B-Lab. We also have Herbrand Haverkamp, who is the Executive Director at the World Benchmarking Alliance. Welcome to you both. We also have Vincent Siegerink, who is an economist and policy analyst at the OECD, and as well part of the facilitation team of the Impact Management Platform. And Vincent will shortly provide a brief overview of the technical content that relates to this discussion. Do we have Eric here? We do?
Hi, Joe. Yes.
Fantastic. I will hand over to you.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Joe. Thanks. Nice to be with you all in virtual means. And a big welcome to Clay and Herbrand and Vincent, who we're going to work together around discussing. We had a very good framing from Achim Steiner and Mathias Cormann about the reason for, and we're going to dig into essentially the why of impact management. I think it's quite useful to see the heads of these important intergovernmental organizations start to drill in on the notion of impact management. And I think in general, we're starting to see an increasing dedication of the partners to this platform and a sort of a willingness to try to reach consensus. Mathias pointed out the issue of multiple standards. It's not simple for corporates and other reporters to make sense of all the moving parts, but we're starting to see a coming together, and I think it's sort of a really important conviction on the part of all of the partners of the platform, around the notion that mainstreaming impact management is going to be critical to achieve sustainability and secure economic and financial returns of the market. we're going to start to dig in, and I think this notion very much around this common belief that it's time to focus really on the notion of mainstreaming the practice of impact management. And specifically, through this launch today of the thought piece on the imperative of impact management, this paper starts to make the case for the need to mainstream impact management and start to break down what are some of, I think, the notions, some of which are conceived, misconceived, around reasons why we shouldn't be undertaking this practice and putting it into mainstream financial and investment management, or all elements, as Achim pointed out, where impact needs to play a role. Main message is, we operate in an economy which is embedded in nature and society, and that the idea that we can continue to use environmental and human resources without properly managing these is somewhat of an illusion. There was actually an article in yesterday's Financial Times reporting on research from a body of actuaries saying that financial institutions don't actually often understand the models they're using to predict the economic costs of climate change. Essentially, the message being that the modeling so far seems to imply that everything is well in control, and I think the implication being that maybe that's not so much the case as we start to increasingly see the changing climate and the changing response, the transition risks related to addressing climate challenge. So I think clearly all market actors have an incentive to start comprehensively understand and then start to manage their impacts on people and natural environment. So impact management is very much, it's not about sort of identifying something that's good, very, very green, and talking a lot about it. As Achim said, that's one of the problems, is it's too much within the communications role, but it's actually taking a much more holistic, systematic approach to identifying, acting on, and communicating organizations' impact. So it's the big picture, understanding essentially the overall business model, what impact it has, not some specific activities being undertaken. Now, Vincent is going to unpack this relationship between impact, risk, and materiality in a moment in a bit more detail. What I would mention is that we see that there are different players, each with different roles. Enterprises who probably have the shortest distance to impact, but perhaps maybe the least responsive to systemic risks, and therefore require maybe impulses or pressures from consumers, from investors, from governments, from all their stakeholders. Then we have the investors, financial institutions, especially large universal owners who have a clear interest in managing systemic risks in order to protect long-term portfolio returns. They definitely need to be putting pressure, demanding that enterprise are doing more. And then finally, the third leg of the stool, governments. Obviously, their number one priority is to provide a policy framework that's coherent and consistent with impact objectives, as well as to mandate disclosure, so impact transparency. So we're briefly going to elaborate on the content of the paper, how it talks about these different players, and I'm going to ask Vincent to do that, and then with our partners, with Gerbrand and with Ben, we're going to start to dig in. Gerbrand with Clay, we're going to start to then dig into what it means for their organizations, and finalizing towards the end the panel with some specific calls to action. So with that, Vincent, if I can give the floor to you to provide a short presentation. Essentially, what is the relationship between impact, risk, and materiality?
Thanks, Eric. Thanks so much for that great introduction. Very good setup. It's my pleasure to present some of the key messages of our paper, The Imperative for Impact Management. This paper is really the product of a series of discussions between the partners of the Impact Management platform over the last few months. And the paper really lays out three key reasons for why impact management is relevant for enterprises, investors, and financial institutions. Of course, impact management is critical for enterprises, investors to operate sustainably, to align with the Sustainable Development Goals, and to promote well-being. But what the paper really tries to emphasize, and the case that the paper makes, is that impact management is really critical for all enterprises, investors, and financial institutions, because it is necessary to effectively manage what we call idiosyncratic or entity-specific risks and opportunities, as well as to contribute to the management of system-wide risks and opportunities. And I'll dive into each of these a little bit more. Currently, what we see when managing sustainability-related issues is that many organizations mostly focus on the management of sustainability-related risks that arise from impacts on people and the natural environment. For example, they may attempt, as you see in this figure, to prevent an environmental disaster such as an oil spill, motivated by potential legal or regulatory risks or reputational risks. What we argue in this paper is that such a reactive and narrow risk-based approach to the management of sustainability-related issues is insufficient to anticipate the emergence of new risks. But more than that, also that such a narrow risk-based approach doesn't consider, as Eric, you mentioned, the fundamental embeddedness of the market in environmental and social systems. And really, one of the core messages of this paper is that the sustained economic and financial performance of the market is reliant on the viability and the stability of these environmental and social systems. And we're seeing more and more evidence around this. The notion that climate change presents a systemic risk to financial institutions and enterprises is becoming more and more ingrained in the market, even though more action is needed, and even though, as you say, Eric, models potentially underestimate the costs of climate change. But we also have evidence in other areas on the link between environmental and social conditions and market outcomes. For example, research done at the OECD has highlighted the economic cost of inequality and income inequality specifically, which was estimated to, rises of which were estimated to amount to 4.7 percentage points of cumulative GDP growth between 1985 and 2005. We know that about half of global GDP is either moderately or severely dependent on nature, and that a partial collapse in select ecosystem services could cost about 2.3% in global GDP by 2030. And we also know, of course, that gender inequality is a continued missed opportunity economically, and that fully closing the global gender gap in the labor market has been estimated to potentially add around 26% of global GDP by 2025. And so we're getting more and more evidence that economic activity and enterprises and investors are really reliant on environmental and social conditions. And what we really want to highlight also is that this is already the case. This is not always some kind of long-term future scenario. The market is already reliant on environmental and social systems. So this figure illustrates in a more systemic view how enterprise impacts contribute to the accumulation of system-wide risks and opportunities. So here you have, for example, a few enterprises, call them A, B, and C, each of which have impacts on people and the natural environment. And these impacts feed back to the market as a whole in the form of system-wide risks and opportunities. What's worth highlighting here is that for some of these enterprises, impacts may be associated with what we call these idiosyncratic or entity-specific risks and opportunities. Maybe they give rise to reputational or regulatory or legal risks. But for other enterprises like Enterprise C, impacts may not always give rise to such risks, but they still contribute to the accumulation of system-wide risks and opportunities, and so they still need to be managed. We know that large institutional investors, of course, have a particular incentive in managing these system-wide risks and opportunities, given their portfolio exposures to such system-wide risks. Finally, the paper makes a specific observation in the context of sustainability-related disclosures, implications that relate to assessing the materiality of information on impact. This is an area where typically we find a perceived strong dichotomy between what might be called disclosures for from an impact materiality perspective and disclosures from a financial materiality perspective. One of the messages in this paper is that a large share of information on impact may well be relevant from a financial materiality perspective. And the paper gives two different reasons for that. One is that information on impact may signal the presence or the emergence of idiosyncratic risks and opportunities, and that this is one reason for the materiality of such information. But information on impact may also signal an entity's contribution to the accumulation of system-wide risks and opportunities, which may be informative for investors who are making financial decisions and are concerned with the management of system-wide risks and opportunities. And our paper highlights a few testimonials from large institutional investors that have indicated an interest in this type of information. We hope that you find this paper useful. You can find it on our website and in the download section of this Bright Talk video. And with this, I'd like to hand it back to you, Eric, to start the panel discussion.
Great. Thanks very much, Vincent. So let's start by looking at where we are today. And Gerbrand, I wonder if you could start with some reflections on the status quo approaches to sustainability risk and impact management by businesses, and obviously drawing on the work that the World Benchmarking Alliance, your benchmarks, what you're seeing today. What is the status quo? And we heard from Achim Steiner at the beginning, a little bit of a critical or a cynical view of the notion of how impact is being used. So what are you seeing from the WBA perspective?
Thank you, Eric, and congratulations to the entire team for the launch of this paper. I would like to start. Let's at least try and start optimistic, and that is that I think what we can see from our benchmarks, that for people that don't know, as we look at the world's 2,000 most influential companies globally, and look at their performance in relation to the SDGs and systemic transformations that need to take place for the SDGs to be achieved. And I think the optimistic picture is that in nearly every industry and in every geography, you can find leaders. Leaders, as in the sense, are companies that are clearly ahead of their peers in terms of how they are managing their impact. Leadership doesn't always mean that the companies are doing enough in the context of what is needed to meet the Paris Agreement, to hold biodiversity loss, and to reduce inequality. But there's a very clear differentiation in the way that companies perform on these issues. I think the other side of that means is that the other side of that finding is, of course, that the majority of companies are really poor performers on our benchmark, which suggests, I guess to me, suggests two things. One is that in relation to today's conversation is that that companies, by and large, are not or only partially managing their impact. That is, I think, what the other speakers already alluded to, and which will definitely be confirmed by our benchmarks. And this is true for the area of social, for nature, for climate, but also for financial institutions themselves. So the majority of companies are struggling to really integrate this thinking and to translate that into the performance of their companies. And I suggest that this is partly, which is I think what we're trying to address with the impact management platform, is a lack of clarity on what the responsibility of business is and what guidance and tools are available for business to actually start doing this in a way that is not only effective, but is also recognized by their key stakeholders. And I think this is where the impact management platform is and the products it creates particularly on this clarity point of view, is really valuable. I think the other side of what we're seeing is partly to explain this lack of impact management by companies, is that it appears to be not consequential enough for companies. So what I mean by that is that whilst the operations and the supply chains and the way and the products and services that companies sell are very consequential to the world around them and to society, it somehow does not seem to be consequential enough to them. And of course, this is where we, what the other side is like, how can we mobilize people, stakeholders, including investors, but also policymakers and regulators, to make sure that the sustainability performance of companies also becomes consequential to the companies. Because if we're not doing this, then two things happen. On the one hand, of course, there's no penalty for the laggards, so there's no penalties for the companies that are holding us back on the global agendas. But the other side of it, this also means that there's no or a very limited reward for the companies that are actually leading on this front. So making it consequential to companies, and the way we talk about it is that to ensure that there's actual accountability is going to be one of the major things that we think we have to focus on in the coming years. And to create accountability, you first need to have clarity on the role of business and its responsibility. And I think this is particularly where IMP is contributing.
Great. Well, thank you, Cormann. Let me take you more specifically from the UNDP perspective. I'm particularly interested in your views in terms of the role of investors in financial institutions. From WBA's experience, is finance sector doing enough to steer investments towards promoting the management of impacts?
No, well, I think no. The short answer is no. Again, here the optimistic thing is that we see a lot more capital being allocated to climate solutions, to nature solutions. We see a lot more engagement across despite whatever ESG backlash there is. We can see a lot more pressure from investors on companies. But we also still see a lot of resources and funding going to the activities in our economy that are undermining progress. So overall, you can say that the financial industry, in the same way as the real economy, is not doing enough to manage the impact. And of course, as you say, those impacts, have said in your introductions, those impacts are merely indirect. But they simply do not have enough of a grasp of the impact of the companies that they're invested in or lending to. Of course, me saying otherwise would be weird if the companies in which they invest are not managing their impacts, and it's going to be very, very difficult for financial institutions to do otherwise. So I think that's a major issue, and I think there's a lot more that we can also expect from finance, and a lot more opportunity for finance can do in terms of what I said earlier about making it consequential for companies. So finance is one of the most powerful actors in society probably to do that. But I think we can be optimistic about the fact that finance in that sense will be more and more flexing its muscle, making impact management more and more consequential to the companies in which they invest, lend, or otherwise do business with.
Great, Cormann. Maybe if I could just ask you one more question. Scope 3 is becoming increasingly important in terms of expectations to understand upstream and downstream, so the full value chain. How do you see, and the SEC, for instance, expecting to come out in October with their disclosure requirements, will include ostensibly Scope 3, although it's still not yet in place. How do you see, what's the impact on companies, and what is the reflection in terms of the impact with those increasing requirements? Expectations in some cases and real in others.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot. Earlier on, people talked about the lack of integrity or the lack of credibility of the net zero commitments that a lot of companies have made, and of course, this is particularly down to Scope 3 emissions. And I think especially for industries where the Scope 3 emission is the gist of the problem. Think about oil and gas, but also food and agriculture. I think these are going to be the industries that have to really, really step up. Because the solutions there are not short term, right? This is not something where you can shift suppliers or where you shift your sourcing base or where you suddenly sell to a different group of consumers. This is really where the long-term transition planning is required. So in that sense, a much greater focus on the role and responsibility of Scope 3 emissions, I think will be a massive driver to the overall transition planning, and to put that more broadly, also to make that a just transition, because also the impacts on communities of these major transitions, particularly are in a way Scope 3 effects. So that is what our expectation is, and our hope is, and the degree to which that will materialize is, of course, the degree that we as society, being it as people, civil society organizations, financial institutions, and regulators, are also able and willing to make the performance of companies on their Scope 3 emissions again consequential to companies.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Cormann. And I think benchmarking, which is the core of the WDA, it's one of the important drivers to put increasing transparency and also pressure on the different types of actors and the progress they can make. And I think you pointed out, unfortunately, the majority of companies are poor performers. So there's a long way to go, and maybe part of the challenge around the issues not being consequential enough for companies. However, you have pointed out that in every area sector we find leaders, and I would like to now shift to play companies that strive for B Corp certification are certainly what we would expect to be leading in terms of embedding impact management processes and how they do business. We assume they understand the need to achieve sustainability, which might be fully or partially motivated by the need to manage systemic risks. So, Clay, could you start off? Let us speak a little bit about what do you think stands in the way of more companies seeing this wider systemic picture?
Thanks. Thanks, Eric. And thanks, Cormann. Many of the things that you touched on, I think, are essential to what we're trying to achieve and are related, I think, to the challenges that companies are facing today already in terms of their ability to progress in their journey of addressing these risks and becoming a bigger player in addressing the systemic issues as well. I think there's really three things that are currently holding companies back. The first one is basic. It's an ongoing lack of understanding of the risks that they are facing, both their idiosyncratic risks as well as the systemic risks, and how those risks are affecting their business today or how they will affect their business in the future. So I think that basic understanding of the consequences of those risks, I think, is essential, and we have to continue to drive that message. The second is a lot of the work that the impact management platform is doing is a lack of understanding of knowing how to put in place practices to measure those risks and to take steps to improve those risks. And so I think a lot of the work that is happening right now in this program with the actions of impact management framework and others are really helping to bring that to life for businesses. So once they understand what the risks are, they have a place where they can turn to saying, okay, this is what I can do to manage those. And then the third one I think is a little bit different, although it will come out of those two, I think, is a lack of understanding of how addressing these risks can ultimately also be good for business. We seem to talk a lot about how the implementation or the management and monitoring and of impact tends to be done from the perspective of kind of a negative lens, as opposed to a more positive lens, which is how are leaders in the space actually doing this in a way that is also positive for their business. And I think speaking to the work that we do at B Lab with B Corp certification in particular, is that B Corps are not just companies, individual companies that are complying with the standard that helps them measure, monitor, and improve on their impact. They're also part of a broader community of business leaders that is showing the way in which other businesses can follow their path in order to be both successful in traditional business terms as well as in business terms that we're starting to talk through today around impact metrics and impact performance. And so while I fully agree always, we need investors, we need consumers, we need governments to be able to drive forward some of these values, we also need the business leaders that both of you spoke about in order to show other businesses the way. So I think one of the most important things that we see in business is that businesses are really good at replicating what their peers are doing, replicating what their competitors are doing, and following those guiding light businesses that are the flagships that we need to be holding up to show how this is done, both to drive impact, but also to be successful from an economic terms. And so I think that one of the most important things we can do as a movement is to make the case that being good for people and planet is also good for business. And I think all the environment that we're creating here is helping to move in that direction.
And Clay, how do you respond when some of the leaders point out that many others are not following their lead, and some of them saying we can only go so far unless the pressure exists on the mainstream to catch up? How do you respond to that sort of challenge?
Well, I mean, I would generally respond by saying, I'm supportive of regulatory reporting requirements that are starting to evolve. I'm supportive of consumer transparency initiatives that are happening that are putting pressure on businesses who are lagging behind. But I think we have to come at it from both angles. You have to come at it from a sort of the stick and the carrot approach. And I think the stick approach is really important to move those that are lagging behind. But those that are really leading, I think, are the ones that are able to show that it's possible to do both effectively. And that's, I think, where they may be struggling to at times pull the rest of the market after them as effectively as they could. And so they do need these regulatory requirements. They do need pressure from investors and consumer groups. I just think it's very important to maintain both sides of that equation so that companies aren't doing this and ultimately just doing it for the sake of reporting or for the sake of meeting the demands of an external party, as opposed to truly embedding it into the business value that they're trying to create with their enterprises.
No, thank you, Clay. That's a good point. And I think part of what sometimes does not get fully acknowledged is the fact that regulators or policymakers take a lot of their inspiration from the action of leaders. Essentially, there's some question, why don't we just sit back and wait for regulators to act? But the reality is, seldom will they act in a void, in a vacuum. Typically, they need to see that at least leaders in the industry are willing and able to head in the direction, and usually they will learn from that leadership. And so that's a very important signaling role in both directions. Okay, well, thank you very much, Brandon and Clay. And I think we've just scratched the surface of what Vincent has been introducing, but I am being instructed to try to finish up the session, and I just want to finish with a call to action, which we'd mentioned earlier, around the imperatives for the three different audiences. And just to very briefly run through these, as I introduced earlier, if we look at the first key role in terms of the role of enterprises, investors, and financial institutions, we really need to focus on starting to unpack and understand and build the capacity around impact management. And it's not only around disclosure. There's a lot of pressure on putting disclosure systems in place, but it's then essentially what sort of business decisions do you start to take based on this information which you're being asked to collect and disclose. Second of all, a call to governments in terms of encouraging and enabling the mainstream of impact management. This is not about some a niche boutique type activity, and it's a little bit how impact investment has been come to be known. It's really about how do we learn from that specialized sector, but how do you mainstream that across economic activities, and the role of governments really on trying to drive uptake in a transparent, comparable, benchmarkable type way. And the signaling that is involved in that in both directions, from the certainty that comes from governments to the private sector, but also the leadership from the private sector providing the signal back to governments in terms of the ability to move forward in the stated direction. The role of standard setters in international organizations in impact management, around collaboration, around, as Mathias Cormann pointed out, we need to work towards bringing together the standards to create complete and coherent systems of standards and resources, the notion of interoperability, so that we start to, across multiple jurisdictions around the global economy, we start to get a standard set of norms and practices around impact management. And finally, standard setters and policymakers in terms of appropriately recommending what needs to be disclosed in what manner, providing the ability at a sectoral level to provide the specialization how you adopt different types of impact management, but in a way, once again, which is comparable and useful from a decision, investment decision or a hiring decision or a product decision, a useful basis. So with that, I will now thank everyone for this great session and hand it back to Joe for the next session. Joe?
Thanks, Eric. And thank you so much as well to Herbrand and to Clay and to Vincent. We are now going to move on to panel 2, which discusses what is needed in order to mainstream impact management. And so this session is hosted by Romina Boarini, the director of the OECD Center on Wellbeing, Inclusion, Sustainability and Equal Opportunities. Romina is also co-chair to the Impact Management Platform, and joined with her today are Ben Carpenter, CEO of Social Value International, and Clay Brown, the head of Standards, Certification and Product Delivery at B-Lab, who we are pleased to welcome back for the second panel. Karine Ab will also be presenting some of the relevant technical content related to this discussion. Karine is the SDGs and Impact Lead at UNDP and also part of the facilitation team to the Impact Management Platform. And so now I hand over to you, Romina.
Thank you, Joe, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. So welcome to the panel on mainstreaming impact management towards a complete and coherent system of norms and resources. And what this panel is going to do is to actually go into the depth of the call for action that Eric just mentioned at the very end of the session. And so that was really an important piece that the platform developed with all the partners. And the idea was really sort of to get to consensus around, what are the next very concrete steps that all the players, actors and partners that have been working together have to put in place. So in particular, we're going to look at the role of international organizations and the various initiatives that focus on the intersections between the private sector and sustainability. And this is certainly one of the important groups that is represented by the platform. As you know, in this platform, there are a lot of actors that really work at this intersection. And we're going to look at specifically what the various platform partners are going to do to play the part. We have, of course, a collective responsibility to make sure that we are providing the market with the playbook for impact management. The previous session has really reflected on the why, on the rationale, and this session is going to look at this playbook a little bit more closely. What this playbook contains is a coherent and interoperable system of standards and resources. And this is really needed to mainstream the notion of impact management and make it the new business discipline. And so we want to make sure that this really becomes the central sort of business paradigm in the way risk management is understood and approached. Today, as you have already heard, we are going to, in fact, release and launch new materials and important resources. This, in fact, in a way, constitute the consolidated actions of the impact management, and they're going, each of those resources to, in fact, tell you in a little bit more specific manner, again, how the different actors can address impact management, work on impact management in a very holistic way. And we think, very importantly, that this playbook and this various set of resources that we're going to discuss in a minute really are relevant and essential for all the organizations, regardless of the mission, regardless of the very specific mandate, and I would even dare to say, regardless of some of the business features, the size of the businesses, the industry. We really sort of worked together with all the partners to make sure that we could get, again, a coherent set of norms and standards that are relevant for the entire market. We're going to have a presentation by Karine Ab in a minute. She's going to develop in more detail the content, but let me briefly outline here that the main actions that we have been constructing together with the partners here include about the point about how do we mainstream impact management in corporates and financial institutions. For instance, the work that has been done under the UN Global Compact, the UNDP Finance Initiative, and the Principle for Responsible Investment. These are just examples of the resources that we are bringing together into the consolidated set of action of the IMP. Of course, we have also in this work leveraged the very important work that was done by Social Value International, the Global Impact Investing Networks, and importantly, we have really sort of highlighted how those different resources can be mutually enhancing and complementary. So they are certainly not exclusive. And all the other resources that in the ecosystem we manage sort of to curate and again bring together things such as the RBC work that the OECD did, but also the UNDP SDG impact standards, the capital coalitions protocols, and a few other resources. Those are all present in this integrated set of actions that we're going to see in a minute. So this really sets a common vision of actions across the different standard sectors that are represented in our IMP. And importantly, they really speak to the big consensus building exercise that we have been here. So I think we can say these are really reflective of the views, the visions, and the practices of the various actors that have been working together with IMP. So importantly, as Eric mentioned, there are three key audiences for which we prepare these resources. First of all, the enterprises. This is content, very pragmatic content that enterprises and organization corporates can use to practice impact management. These are also resources that are especially developed for the investors and the financial institutions that are engaging with these new agendas and need to support their investees and clients on impact progressions and transition pathways. And last but not least, the third key audience for which we prepare material for is policymakers. And of course, this is materials and resources that can certainly input and feed into the important policy and regulatory processes and initiatives that aim at driving private sector alignment with and contribution to social, environment, and development policy. Today, we are releasing a number of resources, as I just said, but in a way, this is only the start of the conversation as we see it. So we would very much welcome your different pieces of feedback on these materials. We are very much aware that this is an ongoing exercise. This is a landscape that evolves very dynamically and very quickly. So we're happy to release this material today, but of course, we stand ready to incorporate any additional pieces of materials and inputs that any of you would like to bring to our attentions. With that, I'd like to give the floor to Karin for her presentation. Thank you, Karin.
Thank you so much, Romina, and thank you for giving such good background on the consensus building efforts across such a diverse set of players and networks. So indeed, it's my privilege to give it a bit of an overview of some of the specific materials that the platform has been working on over the last months. First and foremost, I would like to dwell on the work that we've been doing on key terms and concepts. As Romina pointed out, this is one of the areas that we've worked on. Impact management, as any discipline, has its vocabulary, its terminology, and different usages within that terminology. This is content you will find on the website and that you can browse. Today, I would just like to pinpoint perhaps two terms in particular that are obviously central to the conversation. First of all, impact and the consensus definition that has emerged among the partners, with impacts being understood as the effects of organizations. So here, as you know, in an impact management context, as mentioned at the beginning also by Joe, we're referring to any private sector actors, whether that is corporations, enterprises, or financial sector and investors. And specifically, what we're talking about is the effects of these organizations' actions on the one hand, people and the natural environment. When we speak of people, we mean that both at the individual level, but also collectivities, society at large. You will see on the platform website that this has been unpacked a little bit further, beyond reflecting on what the sources of impact are and what the objects of impact are. We've also specifically explained the notion of the subject or the themes and topics of impact. So we know that we're talking about people and environment, but what are the specific subjects that we're looking at? That might be aspects of well-being if we're talking people. It might be the condition of different elements of the natural environment if we're talking the natural environment. Also, we've looked at some of the drivers, more specific drivers of impact. They're coming from organizations, we know that, but obviously there are specificities in terms of their respective inputs, activities, outputs, and what exactly is driving those impacts and what specifically the impact pathway is. And this is also where different usages, as mentioned before, can arise among different practitioners, different frameworks and resources. And so what you will find is really, in addition to consensus definitions and explanations, really an opportunity to discover the different nuances and how different players, in particular the partners, are using this different terminology. Other term, of course, is impact management that I wanted to pinpoint briefly, since this is the focus of everything here. So the consensus has landed with impact management being the process by which an organization understands, acts, and communicates on about its impacts on people and the natural environment. This is to reduce negative impacts, increase positive impacts, ultimately to achieve sustainability and increase well-being. Although, as discussed in the first panel, there might be a variety of motivations, whether it's first and foremost directly for this aim, or also from a series of other considerations such as risk management, as discussed before, including systemic risks. So before we go into the actions of impact management, the how of impact management, I wanted to take just an instance to flag also something that you will find on the platform website, and which emerged very naturally from the whole process that the platform partners went through when working on definitions, when consolidating the thinking about, what are the components of impact management. And what this basically is the fundamental characteristics of impact management. As you can see, 7 emerged. First and foremost, taking action is the first point. Achim already mentioned this at the beginning. This is about doing. And we also, reflected on this when looking at the different reasons for doing this. But really, independently of motives, the minimum level is going to be to operate sustainably, to align with planetary boundaries, social thresholds, etc., etc. There are a number of others: holistic consideration of impacts, so across topics, positive and negative, consideration and engagement of stakeholders and affected parties, consideration of context, really contextualization geographically is key, integration across strategy, governance, and activities, so the transversality of this. Very importantly, an iterative and evidence-based process, as this is a live process that needs to build continually and improve over time, and also as increasing evidence builds up and we have more knowledge internally of organizations. Finally, last but not least, of course, ongoing transparency on both the practice and the performance of impact management. With that, let's go straight to the other big deliverable or big piece of material that Romina was referencing, and that we're very delighted to be presenting today. So the actions themselves, the actions of impact management, these are the core steps and components of impact management. This is a material that we have in fact iterated and consolidated when the platform first started its activities at the beginning of last year. This content was, an initial version of this content was issued. We actually had this content divided up into 2 complementary segments, one focusing on enterprises, the other focusing on financial institutions and investors. And so one of the things that we're extremely pleased about is that today we're able to present one consolidated view of impact management that enables us to speak a common language across the value chain, from enterprises to financial institutions and to investors. What you're looking at right now is basically the interactive material that we have on the platform website. As you can see, you have a diagram with different segments. Each segment represents one of these key components. One can click basically on each item, and then there will be an overview of what this particular step or action consists in. And there is also specific call-outs for different audiences, whether enterprise, whether financial, also speaking to the different use cases or starting points or motivations. We've heard about, the slightly different motivations that can lie behind the practice of impact management. And then also, very importantly, for every action you will find the specific resources that will be relevant for the implementation of this resource, pointing also to which resource would be relevant for which audience within that action. We do not have time today to go through each of these actions in detail. I'd just like to give a general sense. You see that the wheel here is segmented in 3 sections. In the center, we have the strategy and governance of organizations. We've also already pointed to the fact that independently of whether positive impacts, deliberate positive impacts, are part of the purpose itself of a company or not, whether that is, part of more of, a vision and a strategy, it needs to be embedded in the company's strategy and governance. In the central darker gray part of the wheel, you're basically seeing the specific management actions, starting towards the top right with identification of relevant significant impact topics and themes, moving on to measurement, assessment, and valuation of those relevant themes to understand current levels of practice and performance, which then enables us to move to the next step about setting targets, indeed, in relevant areas and where performance needs to be improved, or indeed on the topics that have been decided up front, if we're talking about enterprises who from the start have embedded a particular topic in their purpose. This is also the moment where action plans are established vis-a-vis the determined targets. We move on with implementation. Again, you'll have noticed by now, this is all about action and doing. Obviously, you will find that implementation needs to be accompanied, as you see in the next item there, by monitoring and learning from what one finds when monitoring. So have we progressed? Have we progressed against the thresholds, and to adapt? Communicate, and you see that as the final action in the middle. You find arrows because, as we mentioned before, this is an iterative process. Companies evolve, portfolios change, and so processes like these all need to be iterated. Finally, outside rings, those correspond to the actions that are performed externally, but that feed in very importantly into a number of these processes. The first one being verification, assurance, certification. This might be relative to a whole process, to a particular product, to disclosures. There are a number of possibilities which are explored here. And finally, the outer ring, which looks at all of what's inside, which is benchmarking and rating, where we find comparisons, between players and their practice and performance. And this, of course, is also, it's externally facing, but also important for the players themselves to understand what their performance is. We really invite you to explore these, whether you're practitioners, whether you're service providers, whether you're in more the policy making and regulatory sphere, and hope that these will be a source of inspiration and clarification. Everything is available freely on the website. And with that, Romina, I think I hand this back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Corinne, for unpacking so well the practice of impact management. And I'm sure that our 2 speakers of the panel, Ben and Clay, are going to cover some of these features as well. I'd like to start with a question to Ben, who is the head of Social Value International, which is a brilliant organization committed to the promotion of positive social impacts and social value. I'd like to hear from you, what is your view on the key differences between the impact management practices, as Corinne has just described to us, and the other approaches to the management of sustainability issues. And so I think you have seen a lot of those practices, going on in the field. So it'd be really, really interesting to get your perspective in terms of what's different in impact management. What do you think all organizations should embrace this very holistically?
Well, thanks, Romina, and it's a great honor to be part of this conversation, especially as we've been working hard for so long together. For those of you who are not familiar with SVI, as Romina says, we are indeed committed to the promotion of positive impacts. In fact, for 15 years, we've been developing standards for social value accounting and impact management that optimizes well-being for all stakeholders. And our vision is of a world where success is defined not just in terms of financial metrics. So yes, we therefore fit well within that sustainability focus label. But one of the joys of the impact management platform is to work alongside other standard setters who are catering for these different audiences, actors that are not necessarily looking to optimize positive impacts, but are certainly looking to be more sustainability aligned. And the IMP impact management platform does such a great job in bringing us all closer together. And the latest outputs that you'll read are a great testament to that. But your question is about the key differences and also maybe commonalities in impact management approaches that you can see across these different audiences. And I'll just want to elaborate on three for you. So the first one I want to talk about is that there is still a difference in terms of motivations and purposes for these different audiences. We have that spectrum. And there are many organizations in the mainstream or even the sustainability aligned group that are still taking quite a narrow approach to impact management. And whilst the latest publication, the Imperative for Impact Management, makes such a strong case for everyone to manage these systemic risks, there is still a focus on idiosyncratic risks of financial materiality that persists. And I think it's clear that we need to move on from that. We need to get people thinking more on this kind of sustainability aligned focus, because we're not seeing enough change in behaviors. And to what Herbrand said at the beginning, there seems to be a lack of consequences if you take that narrow focus on financial materiality. So moving people away from that is key. And I wanted to just give an example, because it really helps people to see the flaws in the system. If we take a recent news story, there's many of them. Just last week, there was a scandal involving a food company that sells pineapples. I don't know if you remember it, but there was a farm in Kenya where the security firm were violently abusing local community members, and 4 people died. Now, this is something that is happening quite regularly, and it's something that nobody wants to see. We have to eradicate it. And with the Impact Management Project, we have the means to change this. There are sustainability focused organizations that would be working with the community to make sure that we're having a positive impact on the community, on the workers on the farm. There are sustainability aligned organizations that would be aware of these risks, these systemic risks, and they would be identifying actions to avoid such horrible things. But there are still some organizations that are perhaps just not have a blind spot for this. And if they're focusing on idiosyncratic risks, these human rights abuses will continue to happen, because the consequences are not immediate for the company or for the shareholders. There's a small reputational harm or drop in finances, but this is incomparable to the value of the experiences by the people who've experienced the impact. So we do need to raise the awareness of these blind spots that are happening and these breaches of human rights that we still need to tackle. And that we can do that with these resources and closer collaboration between us. I think the second point just to discuss in terms of differences is perhaps the integration of this sustainability information with financial. So I think for Social Value International, we're very keen, along with some of the other members of the partnership, to integrate sustainability information with the financial, so that it's not separate, and actually overall picture of success organization combines the financial performance and the sustainability. So bringing those together, I think, is something that we all need to work more on and see how we can do that, because that's ultimately how we make better decisions and improve well-being for all. And perhaps the third one just to highlight in terms of variation, which is applicable to all structured network partners is we should be challenging whether we're measuring and valuing the right things. So are we going far enough to speak with people that experience impacts and understand the changes in their well-being and measure those, actually measure the changes in well-being? I think, it's definitely possible. We, as people, we can achieve amazing things. So it's not an excuse to say, well, we can't measure changes in well-being. The OECD, have got an amazing resource in measuring well-being. It's time that we focused on measuring those things that really matter to people and trying to understand how important they are from people, from the perspective of the people that experience those impacts. And that is something that we all need to work on, regardless of your point on the spectrum, the audience that you're catering for. So yeah, those are just three things. Romina, I hope that helps.
Absolutely. No, I think that's, and what you said really resonated, I think, with some of the points that Karini has highlighted. So this, and other speakers before, so really moving away from idiosyncratic to systemic risk, but also this multidimensional nature of the input considered, how it's important to integrate that within, sort of the core financial performance metrics and not sort of take a siloed approach, because that obviously will absolutely defeat the purpose. And certainly last but not least, bringing in very actively and strongly the voices and the perspectives of the stakeholders. Now, these are all great messages. And because we are a little bit running late, unfortunately, I have to turn the floor immediately to the next speaker, Clay, who is in charge of B-Lab. And I'm really interested to get your perspective on this question around the value of consensus building, because as you know very well, you have been very instrumental to reach consensus here in terms of all the deliverables that we are releasing today. And by the way, Ben was also too. But really consensus building piece is as a value in itself. So I'm interesting to get your perspective on this. How do you think, in your work with B-Lab and the enterprises that you're working with, how this consensus building work really can provide support to progress the mission of impact management?
Yeah, thank you. So I hear from businesses all the time that they feel overwhelmed by the number of initiatives that they're involved in, that are requiring duplicative, overlapping actions, including data collection, data monitoring, reporting, compliance, etc. And this appears to be really a major obstacle to a lot of businesses to be able to change and to implement impact management protocols and systems within their business. They're just engaging too many different initiatives with too many different competing requests and asks of them. These requests and asks are coming from, as we've talked about on earlier in the previous panel, from investors, from regulators, from certifiers, from their customers, and from consumers and other groups as well. And so what we're seeing is that this plethora of asks and competing priorities is really a challenge for businesses' ability to move forward with improving their monitoring of impact and ultimately changing their business for the better. Just to talk to a couple areas, I mean, there's clearly again across that whole spectrum of organizations and actors that are asking of this from business. I think the two I want to focus on really briefly are of in particular importance to a lot of our larger partners. The first one is upcoming requirements, regulatory requirements. So we can think about CSRD in Europe. And the second one is in relation to supply chain management. So how are they engaging their supply chain, tier 2, tier 3 supply chains? And what we are doing, just to speak practically about our work for a second, what B-Lab is doing to address this duplication and complexity of asks is that we are currently in the process of revising our standard, and in addition, developing a new digital impact assessment tool. And so there's a couple things that we're doing as we're going through that process. The first one is we are leveraging practically the actions of impact management framework that Karen shared with us. both in terms of the way in which we are requiring companies that want to be B Corps to manage, measure, improve, communicate their impacts. So really leveraging those exact same steps that Karen was flagging. The second thing we're doing is really working to align our metrics and ensuring cohesion with other organizations who are doing similar work. So that's ensuring we have good partnerships with organizations like GRI, ISSB, SASB, OECD, and others to really work to align our metrics and align the asks that we are having of companies. So while we are not a reporting framework, we see an opportunity for us to really align with reporting frameworks so that companies that are going through the B Corp certification process or using our impact management tool are able to be gathering the data, gathering the information that is aligned with their reporting requirements. And so in particular, how that comes to life or will come to life with regard to CSRD in the EU is that companies that have engaged with the B Corp certification process will be in a better position to fulfill their CSRD requirements and vice versa. So that companies that have gone through verified CSRD reporting will be able to then use that information and data to fulfill their B Corp certification requirements. So that's from a reporting and an overlap with the systems. The other piece where we're seeing a need for companies to be as engaged as possible with a harmonized set of indicators and a harmonized set of practices is also in their supply chain management. So many companies we're seeing struggling with their ability to engage their supply chain and put in place frameworks for their suppliers to measure, monitor, and improve their impact, both for the sake of their own business, but also for the sake of supporting their customers in meeting their obligations and meeting their commitments. And so they're looking for kind of plug and play systems where they know this is a framework that meets all of the requirements that a supplier may be required to meet, both from a metrics point of view as well as a framework perspective. So I think this common framework that we're putting in place here as part of this platform and the work that all of the members are doing to align on that, not from a framework perspective only, but also from a metrics data perspective as well, I think is going to be really essential to businesses being able to take the steps forward that they need to take to address and monitor and improve their impact.
That was great. Thanks so much, I think, to speak to the issue of avoiding duplication and fragmentation, which I think is really sort of the existential reason behind the existence of this platform and the common framework. And really interesting to hear about this new tools that you are putting in place in the lab to go even one step further in terms of making it even more, I would say, concrete and usable kind of on a daily basis. I'm going to wrap it up because we still have one session to go, but I'd like to thank very much Ben, Clay and Karine for the great interventions. Thank you so much. And the floor is yours, Joe.
Thank you so much, Romina, and to Ben, Clay, and Karine. We're now moving into our final panel session, which is looking at the role of policy. We're using this session to really explore what governments can do to encourage and enable the uptake of impact management by enterprises, investors, and financial institutions, as well as how governments might embed expectations around the practice of impact management, and of course, indeed, the results and performance into policy and regulation. And so, ways that could be done, driving positive impacts and, managing negative impacts and governments really driving organizations to do that, such as, by example, introducing standards such as living wage and food standards, or by, mandating responsible business conduct, or indeed mandating impact transparency. But that's just a flavor of it. I have welcomed here today 3 representatives of our partners who are really on the front lines of policy engagement here to really learn from them, their experiences in linking policy engagement to impact management. And so it is very much my pleasure to welcome Cliff Pryor, the CEO of the Global Steering Group for Impact Investment, as well as Fabian Michaud, Director of SDG Impact at the UN Development Programme, and finally Peter Paul van der Weijs, who is the Chief External Affairs Officer at the Global Reporting Initiative. So welcome to you all. We'll go straight into the questions. And so I would love to start with you, please, Fab. So from hearing from you, how can we ensure that policymakers embed expectations around impact management into policy and regulatory frameworks? And what is the role of forums such as the G20 in doing so?
Thanks, Jo. And I'd just like to say hello, and I'm very happy to be here and pass on the apologies of Marcos Neto, who's the Director of the Sustainable Finance Hub, who couldn't be here this evening. So you get me instead. Well, I think the first really important part of this is for everyone to agree collectively that policy has a role to play in terms of mainstreaming impact management, you know, that's something when you come to the regulation of markets isn't always a given. So you know, I think that that's a really important place to start, and I think it is really important. And I like the framing of the goal around governments to encourage and enable the mainstreaming impact management to achieve global policy objectives. I think we also need to look at this from the perspective of where we are and what we're trying to achieve and by when, and the best mechanisms at our disposal to give us the best chance of reaching our desired goals. And I think that that will actually illustrate the case for integrating holistic and systematic impact management into the policy framework, and also give us a frame, actually an impact management frame, to assess whether or not what we're currently doing is good enough and going to get us to where we need to get to. So as we heard from Achim earlier, you know, we're not on track to achieve the SDGs. We're only on track against about 12% of the targets. Progress has stalled or in reverse for many of the others in the aftermath of the pandemic. The global impacts of the war in Ukraine and the mounting effects of climate change. And, you know, increasingly we're you know, developing an understanding and awareness that not achieving the SDGs and our climate goals poses significant systematic risks for all. So if we think about that in terms of impact management language, our baseline is low and we're below our desired thresholds, and the consequences of failure are high. So then what is our goal, and is it ambitious enough? Will it help us solve our challenges? And I think the good news there is that we're seeing policymakers, you know, at a G7 level, G20 levels, the recent summit hosted by President Macron overwhelmingly reaffirm their commitments to reverse the setbacks in progress towards the SDGs, keep temperature rises below 1.5 degrees, you know, halt and reverse biodiversity loss, ensure energy security, end poverty, build a more responsive and resilient financial system that's fit for challenges today, and recognising, importantly, the interdependence across many of these challenges. So the goal seems to be ambitious enough. So then we have to ask ourselves is whether the actions we're taking and the targets we're setting for ourselves are good enough to actually achieve these overall goals and objectives. And here I don't think that we're you know, where we need to be. And I think the actions and responses that we're taking as yet fail to recognise the you know, seismic paradigm shift that we're really going through as we start to hit tipping points and push up against the boundaries of our ecological and social ecosystems, and that requires more transformational than incremental change. So, so with that in mind, you know, how are we currently doing and what are we focusing on? And is it enough? So, you know, my fear at the moment would be that, you know, with so much, you know, so much of the oxygen around the regulatory side centering around reporting, and in particular around ISSB at the global level, that policymakers decide that mandating ISSB reporting is good enough and not push for the broader and deeper changes that we need to drive us towards a more sustainable and resilient and inclusive future. It's a start, but it's not enough. We heard that from Achim before. If we want to achieve the SDGs and keep temperature rises below 1.5 degrees, we need more than a focus on transparency and external reporting to get us there. And what meets the threshold for what we deem to be financially material to reporting organisations. So that broader focus on, you know, on impacts, not not just financially material impacts. And actually, even to understand financially material impacts, we need to understand broader impacts, because that's changing and very dynamic given the environment we're dealing in. So we also need to focus on sustainability of the entire financial and economic system, not just on a very small subset of economic activities and financial instruments that focus on specific positive intended outcomes, because a lot of our focus in the financial system is on the sustainable finance sector, a very small part of the overall system, or on the impact investment subsector of the investment landscape, and that's not enough on its own. We can't just look at that piece. So ideally, I think that we should start with a recognition and agreement by all actors that we need to fully internalise the externalities that exist in our current financial architecture, and markets and private sector actors then supporting the role of good policy and regulation to create that enabling environment and level playing field, and policymakers working together to create the global architecture that facilitates and enables the more sustainable, resilient and inclusive future that we want. In and of itself, I think that alone will drive investment in impact management capability and capacity, because all actors will need to manage their impacts more holistically and systematically to actually survive and thrive in that new financial architecture. So we could look to regulate both practice and disclosure, but not all consequences of regulation are always positive. There are often unintended negative consequences. So if we can drive policy that leads to markets needing and wanting to adopt better impact management practices, maybe that's going to be more effective than regulating practice per se. Policymakers also, I think we need to remember, have lots of different levers, and we often focus on regulation, but they also have a really important role as market enablers and also market participants. They constitute about 40% of global spending. So if they change their behaviours, their procurement practices, if they embed an impact mindset in everything they do, that can have a much broader effect across the economic system as well. So that's so that I think is where we really need to focus attention. At the moment, there's actually focus on the IP SASB standards for the public sector, and I think that that's a really good opportunity to look at that in a way that can drive better outcomes for the public good and help to inform decision making on the public side. Finally, to the last part of your question around multilateralism and forums like the G20, including with the G20, the Sustainable Finance Working Group, which this year is actually focusing on finance beyond climate finance to look at enabling finance for the SDGs, and importantly capacity building within which impact management capacity will be critical, are really important given the increasingly global and systematic nature of sustainability related risks and opportunities, and the need to unite countries and markets in the journey. As we know, as an example, climate change emissions in one country impact all countries, and the benefits and costs are not equally shared. The pandemic showed us that we're a global village, that pandemics know no geographic bounds, and we're only as good as our strongest, as our weakest link. No matter the sound arguments, though, for that, many countries don't want to put themselves in a position of being at a short-term competitive disadvantage to others by moving faster, especially when potentially the consequences of that is that in the end, everybody suffers the same fate. So you don't, so the incentives and aren't well aligned for the behaviours that we want. So that really means that we need to strengthen multilateralism and global cooperation to enable the world to move as one on some of these really big issues.
Thank you so much for that, Fab. You've really set the scene there in terms of why policymakers need to act quickly and indeed the ways of doing so. And Cliff, I can only imagine that this interfaces a lot with your own work, and with the GSG being the Secretariat for the Impact Task Force, which was created under the presidency of the G7. I was just wondering if you could share some reflections on the relevance of this work to the ITF, and specifically how this work really aligns with the ITF's own recommendations to policymakers.
Delighted to, but first of all, just to say bravo, Fab. Absolutely with you, and I think we all need to move beyond our comfort zone. That includes ourselves as well as others. So coming on to that question, Joe, so the work of the IMP is absolutely key to the GSG and to its impact task force. For the mission, and we pledge to promote greater impact transparency of business and investors as well as in governments. And the ITF acknowledged the contribution of the IMP to greater harmonization and convergence of disclosure standards and frameworks. So back in 2021, the ITF called for to support the development of a global reporting baseline by ISSB, but at the same time called to urgently build on that baseline to incorporate impacts on all stakeholders, people and planet. The IMP's thought piece really makes an excellent job of advancing this discussion and providing supporting evidence to the call to action. Impacts on people and planet are not only intrinsically important, but also create system-wide risks that could affect corporate and investor performance in the future. So they have to be disclosed and managed. The ITF also called governments to gradually develop regulation for mandatory impact reporting by companies and investors. Better impact disclosure is just one aspect of broader impact measurement. Disclosure standards tell companies how to disclose, but they don't necessarily tell them how to improve. Coordinating the existing impact management guidelines and frameworks is crucial to guiding market players on how to manage and improve impact. The platform's work in mainstreaming impact management is highly relevant, not only for the G7, but also for the other key international fora for economic cooperation, and also influential jurisdictions, the EU, the US, ASEAN increasingly, that are advancing at different pace in the development of impact-driven policy and regulation. Interestingly, I mentioned EU, US, and ASEAN. Japan's FSA's new draft guidelines include support for innovation, development of human resources and expertise, and also community level. So that's a holistic approach, which we haven't seen in all the jurisdictions. A global and coordinated movement across key market actors and across jurisdictions is really needed to mainstream impact management, and IMP is doing a great contribution to this. At the GSG and the ITF, we welcome the recent developments of the platform and support its work going forward. Different roles for public policy and regulation can play to promote impact-driven economies. There are a number of areas businesses and investors should be mandated to account for and report on social and environmental impacts in order to align shareholder and wider stakeholder needs. We should demand clarity around materiality assessment. It's a fundamental step in the impact management practice. Governments can increase the comparability and reliability of social and environmental metrics by mandating disclosure of the limitations and assumptions beneath them. That includes the basis for deciding what's material and what's not material. We should be adopting the necessary public sector accounting practices. It's an area which has been only had very limited work so far, so that public expenditure meets demands for transparency, for harmonization, and integrity of impact. Capacity building, governments and international organizations should adopt training programs, technical assistance. We're seeing the lack of trained technical personnel to be a limiting factor at the moment. And fiduciary duty, national and international legal frameworks should ensure that directors can pursue impact alongside financial performance and in time encourage decisions based on impact. As has been mentioned, we have to think about unintended consequences of our shared work. in these areas. Regulatory requirements should not overwhelm MSMEs, and we should hear the community voices of people operating at that level. Enterprises on transition pathways need support and encouragement rather than punishment. There are still some jurisdictions, individual countries, where regulatory barriers get in the way of impact activity, for example, on public-private collaboration or combining profit and purpose. And that's something where we recognize GALE as a very useful tool. And all of our shared work should recognize the position of low and medium income countries. And this is why we are at the GSG are working with national advisory boards in countries to engage with the ISSB so that they have a voice in the design and have a clear forward view for future situations. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for this opportunity and for your continuing wonderful work at the IMP. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cliff. And let's just move over now to focus a little bit more specifically on the role of sustainability disclosure policy and standards that can indeed enable impact management. And so, Peter Paul, I turn to you there. The GRI has played a very important role in encouraging impact transparency through voluntary standards. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about really what the latest is in terms of what to expect from future reporting requirements on impact and impact management, certainly including from the policy processes that GRI has been supporting.
Yes, thank you very much, Joe, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. And let's start by thanking all the partners of the Impact Management Project. We've enjoyed working with you, and I think today's session is actually proof that we have reached further alignment. I was nodding almost the entire time that Fab was talking and Cliff, but also listening to Ben earlier, for example, very much aligned. And for us at GRI, the work of IMP is great input to what we're doing. So very pleased with all that. And let's make sure that we continue the conversation. One of the points I want to make here, and it ties to what was said by specifically Ben and Fab earlier, is we see a clear move also in the legislative sphere beyond just financial reporting as being important when it gets to impacts. So the idea that we worked on here in the IMP group and GRI has been driving as long as we exist, as it making sure that the impacts on other stakeholders and the potential of those impacts becoming financial material for companies in the longer run is considered, is crucially important. Quite frankly, that's a trend that we see. Most notably, of course, in Europe, the European Sustainability Reporting Standards reflect this idea of double materiality. But we see that actually in all the conversations we have around the world. There is a trend and an understanding, I should say, that just taking a very narrow approach to materiality isn't going to help the world, and ultimately it's not going to help the investors either. So one point I'd like to make, and I will make, is and it was sort of alluded to, I think, by Cliff. Sorry if I attributed it wrongly. Is there is almost a sequencing needed. You need to understand as a company, as an investor, that full portfolio of impact before you can decide which ones are at what period of time financial material. So that sequence isn't important, but we actually see that developing now slowly in legislation. So I think that's good news. There is a trend also to more mandatory reporting, which is another part of this. It's not good enough to have 11,000 companies use GRI standards. And don't get me wrong, we're very happy with that number, but it's not enough. So mandatory reporting brings the whole market up. So having legislators step in, and we see them stepping in, is a very important point. And maybe finally, knowing that we're over time, I'll keep it short. But the other good news, and the Impact Project is one of the platforms, is we see harmonization and alignment. We are working as GRI very closely with the ISSB and with EFRAG, but also through all the partners in the network. And it was just referenced on with BLab. We need to simplify the system in a way. We need to harmonize so we have the same global comparable data, and we're getting there. We're not there yet. I'm the first to admit that, but we're definitely moving in the right direction. So all in all, good news, and I think what we've seen today in tools will help us there. let me leave it at that, being mindful of the time.
Thank you, Peter Paul. And great to, I think acknowledge across this panel that growing understanding of the role of impact here. I do appreciate that we are slightly over time, but I will just ask perhaps one last question, Peter Paul, before we go to wrap up, which is just really about the accessibility point, which I think is something that a lot of people really are concerned about, the accessibility, but also usability of this data. And so what do you see happening? And what can you share in terms of how we are, working towards improving that for all types of users and preparers of data?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and thanks for bringing that up, Joe. It's also a point that addresses the point about SMEs and making it easier to report. I think what we see happening, this is where technology really is going to help us. We are working as GRI and ISSB and EFRAG and others on XBRL technology, on creating platforms where it becomes easier for companies to collect data, but also share the data. That in a result also makes it easier for stakeholders to actually collect and compare data, because having all that data locked up in PDFs, as we had in the past, was the biggest frustration I can tell you within GRI. You have all that report, you got all this information, and you can't really use it as much as you want. So XBRL technology and web technology is going to help us tremendously create access to the data and make it, to use an ISB term, which I like, decision useful. So we're heading there.
It's a very forward-looking and positive note to perhaps conclude this session on. And so I'd just like to say a massive thank you to all of our panelists, Fab, Cliff, Peter Paul. It's been great to tease some of this out with you all. And I want to actually now move towards concluding this webinar itself. And so we really hope that this has given you a good flavor of the unprecedented collaborative efforts of the leading initiatives in sustainability and impact management via the partnership that is indeed the platform. So just one closing point from me. We have touched upon now a range of different resources and tools to support all types of organizations in managing impact. And this, as we've all been talking about, this represents the consensus view of the partners. You can access all of this on the platform website. If you go to www.impactmanagementplatform.org, there you will find, for example, the thought piece on the imperative for impact management, the actions of impact management, the associated key terms and concepts. I'd also just like to draw your attention to the system map that was published earlier this year, which is a high-level visual of the resources in impact management that are owned by the partners or indeed produced by the partners, and how they fit together across a system, and how they also relate to the different actions of impact management. All feedback on this work is very much warmly received, and we've seen quite a lot of comments and questions come throughout this webinar. Thank you so much for that. Please do keep that coming. We do listen to it and we do respond to it. So you can do that through the feedback section of our website, which you can find in the footer. In that very same footer, there is also a mailing list and also our LinkedIn button. So if you would like to stay up to speed on the collective efforts of the partners, you can do so by subscribing and following us. We will be communicating a number of updates from here, including further deliverables that will be launched towards the end of this year and into next, as well as opportunities to engage more with our technical content. And so we really hope that we will be reconnecting with many of you soon. But to end this there, a massive thank you to all of the speakers. We have so enjoyed hearing from all of you. To everybody that has tuned in today, thank you so much, and we hope to see you again soon.